They left me for dead in the blast. 8 months later, I walked back into his office, and my commander could not believe his eyes. When I say left, I don't mean a dramatic abandonment. I mean there were 3 things wrapped in smoke and noise that night. The sound of metal folding, the list of names on a triage board, and a memory that vanished like a match in a wind tunnel. I remember heat. I remember the metallic taste of fear. I remember glass becoming rain. After that, nothing for a long time. Before the night turned, the ward was a small world of fluorescent light and soft beeps. St. Jude's at 300 smells like coffee with a whisper of sanitizer and too many tired bodies. I worked nights because the day belonged to the loud, bright things, appointments, visitors, empire-building administrators. Nights were where you could actually see people. That was the lie I told myself, at least. It sounds softer than it is. The night shift is where the hospital refuses to pretend it is neat. They called me Elena Vance then, Staff Sergeant Elena Vance when I first left the army, but Elena usually sufficed. I kept the habit of tucking my hair back with something stiff, a frayed elastic, a strip of Velcro, whatever would not betray me mid-sprint. People noticed the way my shoulders sat. The vets in the staff lounge recognized the cheap tactical watch. Sarah, our fresh-faced nurse on nights, thought my silence was something to break with gossip. Dr. Marcus Halloway thought I was too serious. Captain Miller, who coordinated the hospital's security drills with the local SWAT, called me Vance, and only rarely Staff Sergeant. Titles mattered to him in a way they didn't to me. You learn a lot about being invisible in uniform. When people don't ask questions, you can move without fuss. You can zip a blood bag under a jacket or slide a sheet across a table without a dozen eyes. In the Rangers, they call it blending in, mission over spectacle. As a night nurse, I reused that skill. There were no medals on my scrub top, only a name badge that read, Elena Vance, RN. And beneath the fabric, under the line of stitches on my shoulder, a faded patch from a long-ago deployment, reminded me that I knew how to keep people alive with 2 hands and a plan. I didn't show off the planning. I was respectful in a way that made people underestimate how fast my mind could sort a room. Give me a map of the floor, and I could see exits, oxygen sources, weak points in a corridor. Give me a face, and I could tell, in the first 30 seconds, whether they were going to panic or lock down. That comes from being responsible for other people's lives when everything that could go wrong racks down on you. You live in that pressure. You breathe with it. It was a quiet Tuesday. Quiet enough that the regulars could hum the same small frustrations. The old power relay in room 412 that buzzed like an angry fly. Mrs. Gable's insistence that the television always be 2 channels to the right of whatever the staff set. Leo, a 10-year-old with too much bravery and pneumonia, asleep with a hand curled around a stuffed dinosaur. The ward had rhythm. I liked the rhythm. It made the night predictable, until it didn't. Silas Thorne didn't come in through the front doors with a bag of grievances and a bad haircut. He didn't apologize. He came in with a long gun and with a grievance that had been feeding on itself for years. I didn't know his name when he first stepped into our world. I only knew the way the air changed when a rifle is carried with purpose. It arrives like a new note, an intrusion that rearranges everything. He wanted Dr. Halloway. That part was clear from the first words, accusations shouted, ragged and raw. "You killed my boy!" he screamed at the nearest nurse. The speech was thin around the edges, rumors of surgical error, a botched organ transplant years ago that Silas never let go. The hospital is a place that draws attention. It draws rage, too, from people who feel the system took something essential and didn't return it. Captain Miller arrived at our loading dock like a bolt of procedure where there should have been theatre. Calm, commands measured, people snapped into positions. The SWAT team streamed in minutes later, the way they always did during drills, but this wasn't A drill. Sarah's hands trembled when she clutched a clipboard. Dr. Holloway's voice, usually measured, was thin with something I hadn't seen in him before. Defenselessness. People say surgeons are different. They are. They're used to being near control. That night, Marcus looked small, and small things make me angrier than big ones. We had minutes, less than that, before the ward turned into a geometry problem of bodies and exits. Silas staged himself in the main corridor like he owned the lines between rooms. He had a device with him, something he cradled like an argument. I did not watch him handle it. I watched what his hands did to other people's faces. Hands get nervous before mouths do, and his were busy. The first rule in mass casualty control is to not show your panic. My second rule is that every patient is a person. Your job is to buy them time. Those rules inform the small things, where you put a blanket, which hall you clear first, which patient you can move alone, and which one needs a team. The third rule, which no training poster ever makes easy, is that sometimes you will have to lie to protect people. I didn't lie that night about anything big. I lied about my fear. I lied about my hesitation. I lied to Silas about the person he wanted, because silence buys you seconds. "Hands up!" he barked. I raised mine with everyone else, palms toward him. He scanned our faces like a man trying to collect pieces to make a story. When he found Marcus, he stopped. "You took her," he said. "You chewed her up and spit her out." It was a verse he had prepared. For a second I thought of Leo, of the thin cough and the way the child's ribs worked like someone living with a gusting wind. It didn't matter. Silas's story wasn't about our patients. It was about accusation, about a line he wanted to make the world admit it had crossed. I don't remember deciding to act. Decision in the middle of noise is often not a choice at all. It's a muscle memory from years of moving, where others are frozen. I saw the long gun, the way the strap crossed his shoulder. I saw the bolt, and the way a rifle's weight answers the hand that bears it. Training is not about heroics, it's about small interference. I moved like someone who had rehearsed 1,000 silent steps. Sarah deserves the first credit because she was the one who handed me what I needed without breaking. It was a pair of trauma shears, medical scissors, blunt and dull, heavy with the kind of silent promise that a tool gives a frightened person. She tied her hair back with the same frayed elastic as mine and slipped behind the cart. "Now," she whispered, and the word was a hand on my shoulder. I performed the first small deceit, a nurse with a fearful mouth and steady hands. I offered water. His hands trembled, but he took it. His finger brushed the detonator. He kept it in a pocket under his jacket. I could see the wire of something under his sleeve, a ribbon of intent. Captain Miller's voice ticked in seconds on the far edge of my hearing. I have a way of watching how people breathe. A calm breath can be squeezed into a panic breath in a heartbeat, and in hospitals panic has its own telemetry. I used an old trick from transport. Obstruct the line of sight. Invite touch somewhere else. I dropped a tray. It clattered spectacularly, everyone startled. When he turned, I moved. It is not valor to think of yourself as invincible. Valor is simple. You take the job and accept that the job might mean you bleed. I clung to that sentence the way someone clutches a rope. My fingers found the barrel's balance just long enough to jam the long gun. Not clever, just a deliberate, blunt insertion of metal into a mechanism already compromised by 1,000 previous uses. He cursed and swung. Sarah ducked, and I took a blow to the forearm, that white-hot pain, and then a hotter impact. My elbow tasted of iron. I hit him with a cart. He stumbled. He was humanly felled for a heartbeat. We moved like a single organism then. Me, Sarah, 3 orderlies. We'd practiced restraint techniques in simulations. In the real world, your hands are smaller than your training. We kept him from the trigger. That was the important bit. Without a trigger engaged, his threat was reduced. He was angry, and he had bruises. He was also not as neat a villain as the movies make it seem. He had the tired face of a man who had lost a lot and had decided to make noise about it. But he had an accomplice inside the oxygen room. The oxygen manifold was not where you would expect it to be unless you knew. Hospitals are full of hidden arteries, main lines behind walls, unused vents that still breathe life into rooms. The oxygen manifold in our wing fed 6 rooms. Behind it, in a storage alcove the size of a closet, someone had put what looked like a killing device. You don't breathe near oxygen when something burns. Oxygen feeds fire like gossip feeds rage. It is not technical to say the obvious. Oxygen and heat are a law that is not subject to argument. When someone starts a fire next to oxygen, everything becomes arithmetic you do not want to do mentally. It is the physics of escalation. You contain it. You stop the feed, you get people away from the source. I remember reaching for the manifold gloved hands, clumsy with adrenaline. I could smell the faint, chemically sweet scent of fuel. Silas laughed then. Real, thin. He had an armful of wires and a tube that would not be confused. "You fix her," he said to Marcus. He wanted the world to answer. Marcus's face split like paper. He was speaking, but the words were underwater. Captain Miller's voice through the radio was tight. "Hold positions. Evacuate non-ambulatory patients with priority." The orders were clean. The ground was chaos. We started moving people like freight. Leo was small enough that I tucked him into my chest and felt his heartbeat like a small engine. Mrs. Gable clutched at a rosary that made no sense in the middle of an emergency, and I promised her the TV would be on when this was over. Promises are currency in hospitals, poor ones at that. We improvised sleds out of gowns and blankets. People became plans. We became a chain stretching to the doors. You learn to improvise when you've seen enough plans die. Outside, for the first time that night, I heard the shriek of a siren that was too close to be a film. Captain Miller took a position at the threshold of the main corridor and barked contact calls. He didn't look surprised when the gunfire cracked. He had expected this. If men like him can be said to be at home in anything, it is in procedure. Procedure is how you make the living world less wild. The first explosion, if I can call it that, was a sound and an absence. It ripped through the ward like someone tearing a page. It killed the fluorescence. I remember the smell of shorted electricity. I remember the lights going, the ward losing its heartbeat. Walls that had felt solid became dust. For the space of one breath, the world was only sound and the sensation of falling. We were trained to go to ground. Do not stand where glass can cut you. Do not stand where structural load can fail. But people are not training manuals. The nearest thing to me at that precise second was Leo's small body and a sheet. I threw him across my shoulder and ran, like the world had already declared war. After the first blast, there was confusion. Drums beating in my chest and a thick, choking dust everywhere, like someone had tried to rewrite the air. The sprinklers started with an indecisive hiss. Smoke began to spread in slow, thick fingers. Someone screamed a name. Captain Miller's voice edged through the smoke, steady and sharp. "Sweep rooms. Check for secondary devices. Account for patients." Secondary device. The phrase tastes wrong when you say it in a hospital. We cleared rooms. We moved along the walls like rats in a disrupted maze. We found people who could walk and pushed them toward the courtyard. We found others who could not. There is a limit to how many hands you have, and even fewer in rubble. Mrs. Gable was not one we'd leave. Neither was Leo. Dr. Halloway clung to a counter and cried once, a short, helpless sound. He had the kind of guilt you can't schedule. It sat in him like a tumor. The second blast was not like the first. The first took the veneer off the room. The second took the bones. It blew in on a corridor we had just passed through, 2 turns ahead. It was focused, the kind of blast that comes from being clever, where you assume you'll be dumb. The oxygen manifold, someone had lit it. The rush of an oxygen-fed fire will make sounds you have no language for. It was a howl. I heard Captain Miller's radio cut out mid-sentence. He swore under his breath, the way only soldiers or very tired men do. Then the world leaned. The ceiling sagged as if a large animal had folded into the room. Things that had been bolted became flight. I felt something slam into my thigh. I hit the floor. For a second I had a perfect, stupid human thought. Glass should not fall like snow. When the dust settled, we were half buried. The fluorescent lights melted into molten stalactites. I clung to the last stable thing I could find. A bedrail, an IV pole, anything with a vertical line. My hands worked by habit. Check pulse, clear airway, find a name band. I remember my fingers tracing over the badge, feeling the letters in raised metal. My name, cold and real. That small, cool thing under the ash of the world felt like a talisman. Someone shouted my name, or maybe it was a name like mine. Voices had become a geography, and I tried to find them by sound. Sarah's voice came in short bursts. Dr. Holloway's sobs were now gasps. Captain Miller's orders were less surgical and more like someone trying to anchor a boat in a storm. "Vance," someone called. I tried to state where I was, but my lungs were full of something that wasn't air. Pain bit like a wire along my ribs, a flare of something hot. I remember thinking with the odd clarity of shock that I could not be a corpse, because corpses don't hurt. Pain meant living. Pain meant things could change. I tried to move. My hand brushed against something warm. Human warmth. I pulled and found a wrist, a patient's. I tugged, and the sheet came with it. We were a tangle of people and hospital detritus. For a long, hazy second, I thought someone had draped a blanket over my face. The world kept rerouting itself around the thick smoke. Then I heard a different sound, the sound of a man cursing like he was trying to become something large. It was Silas, I thought. He was running. And then there were heavy steps and the smell of diesel or something else, like the world had been rewritten. The medics outside were doing what medics always do in emergencies. Triage, shout, move, decide. I could hear the numbers of the triage tags, the words red, yellow, green thrown around like bad towels. They were moving at the speed of urgency. People were flowing out of the hospital in a ragged river, blankets like small islands. I heard the creak of stretchers. I heard the thunk of metal against pavement. Somewhere in the press of bodies and alarm, somebody found a phone and started documenting. Camera light is an odd thing in life or death. It turns people into evidence. It will become proof later. My name badge was found near a collapsed alcove, half melted. Someone held it up because it made a picture. They took pictures of the hole where the manifold had been. They took a picture of Marcus, kneeling, hands to his face. They took a picture of a memorial plaque that wasn't yet a plaque. They could have pulled me out right then. Or maybe someone did. I cannot be sure of the precise geometry of rescue and failure. After a while, people start to blur into roles. Rescuer, victim, witness. After a stretch of shouting, the rescuers organized a body-handling perimeter. They were counting. They were taking names. Triage demands you know who you have. Knowledge is safety. When you are in that space, and I have been in a lot of them, you learn the meanings of small phrases. No pulse means a lot. Pronounced means even more. Unable to locate becomes a sentence somewhere between accusation and clerical error. People do not like to say, "We couldn't find her." Better to have a body, even a burned, unrecognizable body, because then you have closure. The absence of a body is a problem that looks practical but smells like accusation. I felt hands pulling at my shoulder. The fingers were tentative, searching for purchase on a person who had once been solid and was now a thing that might break. They had blanket. They had a voice that was now too used to being harsh on the radio. "Get her out," they said. The man moving me had the smell of diesel and smoke. His face had coal on it. He was working like someone with a mission. They dragged me out from under a beam, and the angle of my hip told me it wasn't right. I tried to breathe, and the world kept hiccuping around me. I knew the numbers for resuscitation by habit, compressions, airway, oxygen. The med team started them. Fingers thudded against ribs. Someone called the cadence. Someone counted. Silence is the wrong word. There was noise like a distant ocean. I could feel my mind trying to fasten onto something. A memory, a number, a face. I saw Leo's dinosaur for a blink, and then a hallucination of snow, then Dr. Halloway's hands with a rosary no longer white. My world broke into small, vivid images, like a film reel snapped in the middle. I remember very distinctly the feeling of being lifted, and the thought that if they left me here, I would accept it, and I would forgive them for moving on. It is a strange thought to have when people are hitting your chest like a metronome. In the liminal edge between consciousness and not, you don't always feel angry. You feel small. You feel human. They loaded me into an ambulance. The gurney was a shaking platform for a life. The siren was a high animal. I recall hands pushing, a grate of a strap tightening, the smell of something warm pressed to my face. Someone said my name like a prayer. "Elena, hold on." It sounded like Captain Miller, but that could be memory-making narrative that did not exist. I clung to those syllables like a lifeline. The stretcher tilted and the world turned. There was a point when it felt like being swallowed by something vast and indifferent. My lungs fought for air and got it in fits and runs. The paramedic had a flat voice and efficient hands. "Do you have any history?" she asked. It was a formality. I had a long history. I had scars that a guard at the gate of a base once said made me look like someone who kept secrets. I thought about telling her about the Rangers and the nights we were up under stars that held no mercy. I thought about telling her that I had been a nurse as a kind of redress. I do not think I could have formed the words. They wheeled me into a triage tent beside the hospital, an ugly utilitarian mouth that took in patients like a river dam. The doctors made incision after incision into my consciousness. There were needles and gauze and a strange, loving violence to their hands. I remember feeling cold and then hot and then cold again. There was a series of faces in overhead light. Someone said, "No response to pain," which is an ugly phrase that tries to make living sound mechanical. Then someone else said, "We might have to declare." Words like declare are the weaponized ends of bureaucracy. They slice human life down into paperwork. I heard the word and tried to move my fingers like it was a test. They wouldn't obey. There was a man who looked like he had been wearing a uniform once. He had salt at his temples and a jaw that had been taught to hold back too many feelings. He knelt beside me and read my name band. "Elena Vance," he said softly. "From Seattle Rangers." He had the wrong unit name, the way people do when facts get mixed in the press. His mouth shaped apologies that he would not yet be able to keep. Then the world narrowed further, faces blurred, sirens overlaid with the bark of someone giving orders. My ears clogged and then the bed lurched. I tasted the air again, metal and something like burnt sugar. In that last precise sliver of waking, there were things I could not yet know. There would be photographs tomorrow. There would be a plaque. There would be press lines and someone at home who would be told that I had died. There would be a list of the missing. Marcus would be asked in interviews, the kinds of questions that leave marks like fingernails. Captain Miller would stand in a parking lot with headlights painting his face and the weight of procedure heavy at his shoulders. Sarah would cry, and I would be a name in those tears. Then the ambulance doors closed, and the world went quiet in a way I cannot explain. The med team worked like a machine. At some point they admonished each other. Someone said a last clear number. I felt myself letting go of the small talisman my fingers had molested, the cool metal of my badge, and into a place that had no light but an odd, distant hum. If you stay too long in that hum, you begin to think of your life as pages. Mine flashed like pages set loose in wind. Deployment tents, a child's laugh in room 410, a surgeon's apology bled out in a moment. There was no closure, just movement. Outside, people were counting survivors. They had to know who they had. Names were called into radios, lists were ticked. Somewhere near the main entrance, a media van had arrived, cameras already set to record the flame-licked metal of a once-familiar corridor. Someone pressed a photograph of a smiling nurse into the lens. The image would travel later in pulses, as social feeds and news bites. Inside the tent, hands worked. I felt the world slip sideways and then not at all. My breathing went shallow and then nothing. For all intents and purposes in that moment, I ceased being part of the count. They covered my face with a sheet when they did what the procedure required. The sheet smelled of bleach. There was a weight of hands above it, tender, mechanical. I felt a warmth move away. I felt a hand close on a wrist, like an anchor drawing back. I did not die in a heroic blaze, at least not in the conventional script where you go out with a final triumphant roar. I did not speak my last words in a perfect sentence. I fell into a place where time was made of small, precise absences. A missed heartbeat here, a breath that failed there. It was the kind of thing you cannot claim later as drama. When they folded me into the record as someone who had not survived, the world took it and made it right. They put my name on a board. They pinned flowers on a gate. They fed the narrative of a life ended in service. People found comfort in that tidy thing. Someone announced it had been done, and so the world could move on. People in uniforms gave statements and appeared on televisions with grave faces. The mayor came later with a ribbon. Marcus spoke in a voice like a man who had swallowed a pebble. But presence is stubborn. Some things, like breath and memory and stubbornness, do not know how to stay missing forever. In the cavern where I hung between consciousness and the next thing, the story fragmented into pieces. I could not imagine then the 8 months that would pass. How they'd stitch a life back together, with thread that had to be rewoven slowly and painfully. I could not imagine the way the commander would slide open his office door 8 months later and find me there, not as a ghost, but as a woman with scars and unfinished sentences. For now, all of that was ahead. For now, there was only the sheet and the echo of boots and the way the lights had gone out, then back on, like a heartbeat that had found its rhythm in the dark. If this kind of story, raw, quiet, the kind that favors the invisible work of people who step into danger and count what matters, grabs you, stay with me. There's more to it than the image in the paper, and I promise, the rest is the hard work of getting back. The first hours after are a map of decisions made in adrenaline. When I came back, if you can call it coming, the world had already decided a version of me. News tickers, a plaque in the chapel, cards at the nurses' station that started with "in memory of." They had created a story that made sense to them because it was tidy. That was their comfort. It made their grief possible. But tidy stories are usually lies. Real lives are ragged and complicated and smear in ways you can't sterilize. In the rubble, something heavy pinioned my leg. I remember the bright, crystalline pain and the way a beam pressed down hard like a judge. The light over my head was gone, the world reduced to a cone of dimness, punctured by ash. There were shouts that came and went like wind. Someone called my name more than once. I answered with a whisper that might have been my name or might have been a curse. "Hold her," someone said. The voice was near, then far. Hands gripped me with the urgent gentleness of people who have seen too many endings while still wanting to make different ones. They set me on a board. The inside of the ambulance smelled like the petroleum of the world outside. The medic tried to find me a vein. I felt a sting and then a profound lack of feeling in my limbs. A man who had the look of someone who'd been ordered to be composed all his adult life, Captain Miller, stood with his back to the entrance and watched the tide of people. Marcus was a mess of apology in hands. Sarah clung to a clipboard like it was a lifeline. Somewhere someone was taking photographs and giving them to a man with a badge who might later, in a courtroom or on television, pronounce the night into a sentence. They transported bodies to the medical examiner in a convoy. In the official records, they listed names, statuses, times. They labeled the living and the dead. Names that had been on the roster in the morning were crossed out, marked in ways that people in the future would treat as scripture. Elena Vance, deceased. The phrase would be printed and circulated and repeated like an incantation of closure. But in the ambulance, in the space where sound is metal on rubber, someone misread a monitor, or the monitor misread me, or the protocol at the field triage had been overwhelmed by the number of people who needed things it couldn't provide. In that thin margin of humanity, mistakes happen. Lives reorganize around those mistakes. Grief claims the empty chair. My last clear memory before the black was of Captain Miller's face, an avuncular, exhausted thing that made a small sound that might have been a prayer. "Hold on, Vance," he said, and I thought I would. Then anesthesia, chemical, precise, folded over me. It was the most peaceful thing, an arranged surrender to darkness. I don't say this to be melodramatic. I say it because the truth of being left for dead is not that someone unspooled a plan to abandon you. It's that institutions make stories to survive calamity, and sometimes those stories smooth away the presence of inconvenient outcomes. They need the narrative to make order, and they prefer their narratives tidy. When the world would print my name as if I were a thing already ended, they did not know that my lungs were busy wrestling with a future that had not yet been written. They did not know that my life had more stubbornness in it than a headline could hold. The lights in my vision crackled out. Pain receded to the edge, like a dog put outside. There was a breath. Then silence. I had been left for dead in more than one sense. Left in the ashes of the hospital's public grief. Left on a list marked deceased. Left where a world could compartmentalize its sorrow. But even in that absence, something kept time in me like a watch that never wound down. Stubbornness. The sort that, later, would bring me back into his office and make him look twice. In the darkness, I went somewhere else. The ambulance doors closed, and the chopper rotors thudded a rhythm that only the injured hear as music. The tense noise turned into a far-off place. I was no longer sure whether I had been carrying Leo or whether he had been carrying me. I did not know that 8 months would pass before I would be back where a man with authority could be ashamed of his certainty. For now, there was only the hum, and the way air tasted like metal and something sweet. For now, there was the final cadence of people declaring things into microphones and radios, and the way lives reconfigured themselves in the light outside the tent. They covered the last open veins and folded the tarp. In the public story, they would file me away. In my private one, there was a thin, tenacious thread left uncut. It stretched through the dark like a memory of wind through a canvas tent, and it would be the reason I came back to shock the man who had believed me gone. The blast had done its work. The hospital had been struck. People had been counted. The press had their leads. The mayor had a ribbon to cut. Inside the rubble, beneath names and badges and the fat ledger of officialdom, one woman was still holding on like someone with no other currency. I didn't know then what the 8 months would mean. I didn't know the surgeries, the months of waking to alien faces, the way a hand once steady could tremble when asked to do a small, deliberate thing. I didn't know that people would make me a memorial and place flowers on a fence that I would later walk past on my own feet. I didn't know that Marcus would carry guilt like an invisible bruise, and that Sarah would sleep with the lights on for weeks. But I did not yet know how loud their grief would be made to speak for me. I did not know they would pin a ribbon, read my name aloud on the steps of a building I had walked into 100 times, and lay flowers against a fence where my uniform had been folded into a neat, respectable grief. I did not know they would write me into a script with a tidy ending because the world wants endings it can manage. What I did know in those first dim hours was only this. My body was a geography of broken things, and my head was thick with cotton and the smell of antiseptic. Somewhere in the interchange of men and machines, a box of my life had been misplaced, and for a long while the people outside that box assumed what they needed to assume. My first clear memory after the black was of light through plastic. Beds around me hummed, machines breathed for strangers. When I opened my eyes, the world was quiet in a way that made my ears ring. There was a tube at my throat, a ribbon of clear tape across my mouth. Someone was speaking low and careful. My hands were tethered by soft straps. My legs were a map of pain I could not feel fully. They were wrapped and warm, the kind of warmth that in the field meant dressing and insulation rather than comfort. A woman with tired eyes read my wristband and then looked at the chart clipped to the curtain rod. Patient is stable, vitals are acceptable, doing well for a severe polytrauma. I mouthed the words, "Where am I?" and no sound came out because the tube did its work the way modern engines do, efficient and impersonal. "You're in Harborview," someone said. The name landed like a buoy. Seattle Regional Trauma. Harborview was the place you went when your life had been commas and fractures and needed to be spelled out. It smelled like expensive cleaners and too strong coffee. It smelled like organized specialist attention. They called me by a different code at first. I had been moved, shifted through a system that was stretched thin and doing the best it knew. The people who pulled me out had done so under impossible conditions. The medics at the first sight had to make decisions, with screens blacked and hands slick with smoke. Somewhere in the handoff, a badge was lost or misread, a patient label swapped amid the noise. The person who held the body, that later became mine in the county morgue, wore scrubs like mine, and had a name tag that had been partially melted. Someone who had been trying to help in the field misidentified the tag, and an official record crossed a line into a new reality. Officialdom prefers names and boxes to indeterminate suffering. It stitched a narrative together, and it gave it to the world. So while the hospital down the road put flowers on a fence and read my name on a plaque, I lay in a bed and watched the rebuild of my face in private. There was no ceremony for the hours that would become my life. There were operations, and then operations that followed the first operations, as if the surgeons were picking at the edge of a frayed seam to find a new pattern that would hold. They replaced tissue where the blast had stripped it. They grafted skin, borrowed from thighs and backs. They rebuilt the plane of my face with precise, patient hands. They carved, sewed, waited. At first I could not move my fingers the way I wanted to. They were clumsy, like tormented instruments being tuned. A therapist came in with a handful of rubber balls and a patient smile. "We start with the small things," she told me. "Grip, release, reach. We get you the rest in time." Time became a long work of small returns. 1 inch of motion, then 3. It was arithmetic in reverse, subtracting because the blast had taken, then adding back what could be coaxed from scar and muscle. My voice was a rasp when they first let me try to whisper. Words came out like someone testing old keys on a broken piano. Family photos had been taped to the wall by hands that were not mine. A photograph of a nursing station with a smiling woman in scrubs sat crookedly on the bedside table, the face recognizable enough that I cried once at the sight of it. Part mourning, part terror that strangers had already decided who I was. There were people who did not know to keep their grief private. Marcus would visit in the early days. He'd stand at the foot of my bed, like a man trying on armor that did not fit him. His hands shook when he spoke, and he had the look of someone trying to make penance without having found a way to do it. He apologized in fragments. "I should have," he'd say, "I should have seen." He never finished sentences that mattered. Guilt, I learned, is work your mind will do when it cannot hold you. It chewed at him. It made his face small and anxious. Sarah sat closer, sleeping in a chair until the nurse had to tell her to go home and bathe. She brought me things. An odious paperback novel, a loose-knit cap, a stuffed dinosaur that had been cleaned more times than it deserved. There was a practical side to my recovery that was less dramatic but more relentless. I had multiple debridements. They cleared away dead tissue. I had a tracheostomy for a while, a small ventilating doorway into the lungs, because the throat had been burned and swollen and would not let me breathe on my own at first. There were antibiotics, high-powered and unromantic. There were times I woke up with strangers leaning over me, reading charts, adjusting drips. There were days I could not recognize my hands because the swelling blurred the lines of bone and tendon. There was a phase my skin changed color and my imagination went with it. For a long while I avoided mirrors because the woman who stared back did not have enough of our history in her face to be familiar. When they pulled the tube out for the first time, it felt like learning to swim in a cold river. I coughed until tears strobed at the corners of my eyes. The first words I could form were small, water, and name. They sounded like tests. If I could name myself, I could make the staff stop worrying about me. They applauded when I could sit up with assistance. The therapist would say, "Another degree of extension," and my life would become a series of these small, testable victories. Months went by, measured in increments that a calendar could not entirely hold. There were good days that made promises, and bad days that took them back. Some nights I would be awake with the tunnel light of pain that made the room shrink to a pinhole. My dreams were not cinematic, they were practical. The weight of debris, the smell of smoke, the shouts of "move" that would turn into applause in the media. Sometimes I could not tell whether the voices in my head were real memories or newsreels that had interleaved themselves with experience. I had vivid, hard flashes of the blast, so visceral that I would bolt upright and find the walls of the ward leaning at the wrong angle. Outside my private struggle, an entire public life had been built around the tidy version of me. They had made a plaque. They had held a moment of silence on the steps of St. Jude's, the hospital where I had worked. They had called me a hero in the press, with photographs taken from before my life was unstitched. People made hero out of absence because it gave them an object to grieve. It let them tie a ribbon. It gave them a place for their shock. It made them less accountable to the messy parts of truth. I watched my own funeral in pieces, television clips, and comments from a mayor who had never met me, and interviews where friends called me brave, because grief can never resist naming someone in a way that helps the living sleep. I felt at times like a ghost watching my name travel without me. The legal fallout followed as an ugly, procedural second act. Silas Thorne was arrested when he tried to leave the scene. He did not fight being caught. Perhaps he'd conceded the fate of his own grief to his anger. They put him in handcuffs that I would later see on the news, sitting in a courtroom that smelled like old coffee and formal clothes. There were hearings and depositions, the kind of slow-motion moral accounting that the public likes. A man with a grievance facing a man with a badge. Marcus testified. Captain Miller testified. They all said things like protocol and containment and triage until those words began to lose their meaning and become shapes on paper. At first, I wanted to be involved. My natural reflex was to be present. And then I realized I could barely read a file without falling asleep. The trauma rewired my sense of priority. I had been good at a kind of cold, clinical planning before. Recovery forced me to feel my way through the world again, and legal cross-examination is a different discipline than a bandage. The papers called me the nurse killed in the explosion, and the prosecutor used the public narrative as a lever to make a point. People needed a villain and a closure. The court gave them both. Silas Thorne was convicted on charges that matched the harm he had done. In the gallery of the courthouse, I would later sit and watch him, the scrape of his pen like a small animal noise. He had a face like so much loose flint, sharp edges, and nothing warm. The sentence was severe. The judge said grim things about accountability and the sanctity of life. People clapped in the public gallery because they always do when a story resolves. I could have chosen then to step back into the public narrative they had made for me. I could have let them place me on a pedestal and call it recovery. Instead, the slow work of stitches and strength pulled me away from theatre. The world expected me to be a symbol. I wanted to be a person with a cast of scars and a list of needs. There is a delicate, humiliating work to healing that doesn't make good headlines. It's physical therapy at dawn. It's hands that have forgotten how to tie knots. It's relearning how to hold a cup without thinking of the way a gun feels in your palms. There are bureaucratic forms about disability that make you feel like a second-class version of yourself. There are doctors who say, "She's come a long way," and family members who count stitches like currency. There are nights you wake and cannot find the line between gratitude and grief. I would have liked to say that I healed because of some inner decision, a kind of moral resolve that is pretty in speeches. The truth is messier. It was surgeries, yes. It was the high-quality care of people I did not know. It was the therapy dog that visited and licked at my face like the world could be convinced of softness. It was a therapist who taught me how to breathe into fear instead of exploding from it. It was Sarah sitting with me for hours, making weird faces and forcing me to laugh. It was a man from my old unit, Commander Hayes, who sent a letter that he had not meant for public distribution, telling me in the blunt, precise way soldiers do that I had been the kind of person who does not leave a hole unfilled. It helped in small ways to be told that my work had meaning. 8 months passed, measured in a new calendar. There were times when the months piled like bricks, heavy and indistinguishable. Then a morning came when I could get in and out of the shower without help. Then a week when I walked, with a cane at first, the length of a ward. By the time leaves turned in the city, I could stand without the cane for minutes at a time. My face still carried the map of surgery. My hair had come back in strange patterns. I had scars like medals, but without the ceremonies. Somewhere in those months, Captain Miller had to give interviews and deal with internal reviews. He bore in public the weight of protocols, and in private the burden of decisions made under pressure. He had been the one who coordinated the first response, and when things went sideways, leaders always carry the aftersmell. Dr. Holloway retreated for a while from public life. He enrolled in counseling and began to speak with a kind of vulnerable bluntness at rounds. Sarah, the one who had handed me the trauma shears with the same frayed elastic, took up more responsibility at the ward and looked at me in photographs with eyes that carried a new kind of slim fierceness. They all did what broken people do. They tried to mend. I did not tell many people I was coming back. I wanted the re-entry to be without fanfare, because I had been turned into a martyr without my consent. But I also knew that if I walked into the parking lot and my presence registered in the wrong way, if it became a spectacle, it would return me to being an object rather than an agent. I wanted ownership. When I decided to go to St. Jude's again, it was not a dramatic plan hatched in the space of a week. It had been forming for months, like a patient bruise. I had been in physical therapy, and I had returned to light shifts at Harborview as a volunteer, sitting with patients who had sleep issues and holding a hand while someone worked through fear. My presence in the hospital corridors had started as a necessity, paperwork I needed signed, meetings with administrators about safety protocols, and evolved into a deliberate reclaiming. The final nudge came from a small thing. The day Sarah sent me a photo of the plaque they had installed outside St. Jude's, with my name on it in bronze letters. She'd written, "They say your name like you'd already been gone." Her text was small and plain, and it contained both rage and affection. I felt a heat behind my ribs, neither entirely anger nor only grief. It was something like amusement. I planned the moment quietly. There is a satisfaction in small decisions that are yours and yours alone. Which day to pick, what to wear, scrubs, because it seemed right. Whether to use a cane or not, I didn't. I made sure my hair would be practical. I asked Sarah, who had gone back to nights, to be on alert in case my plan required adjustment. I wanted to be surprised by the reaction. I wanted the shock to be genuine. Captain Miller had an office set back from the unit's command hub. He had made that office his command center in a way that suited him. Maps, annotated diagrams, a coffee mug perpetually half full. He had not expected me to return in the morning, and I like to think that was part of why his reaction was raw. He had been given a version of me that fit the disaster of that night, and the version had done its work. It had let him sleep in a certain way. It had dissolved the doubt into something manageable. My arrival unstitched that little comfort. When I walked into the hospital that morning, it felt like the first step back into a scene after being off stage for a long, quiet intermission. The fluorescent light seemed sharper than I remembered, and the corridor smelled faintly of lemon-scented disinfectant. People looked up. Faces pooled through a dozen small doorways. Sarah met me halfway. Her eyes were wide at first, then narrowed like someone negotiating a smile. "What are you doing here?" she asked, but she didn't sound angry. She sounded like she had been waiting for permission. "Walking back," I said. My voice had reclaimed some of its old cadence. "Figured I'd see who'd notice." We walked in together, because the absurdity of showing up alone in such a charged place was glamorous in a way I didn't want. The ward had changed some things. They'd repainted and put up a wall chart for the new safety drills they'd put in place after the inquiry. There were flowers at the nurses' station in memory of the night, a small cluster that had been placed for months. I passed them with fingers that brushed the air like someone not quite ready to touch yet. I didn't have a plan to stage a public reveal, but plans exist for people who trust that outcomes will obey instructions. The world is not that neat. Captain Miller had a meeting scheduled with the hospital administration that morning. He sat at his polished desk when we arrived, a stack of papers before him like a small fortress. Mrs. Gable's television set had been repaired, and Leo had finally been discharged and had returned to school. The ordinary world had been folding back into itself. Captain Miller looked up and met my eyes the way a man meets either a memory or a ghost. I walked in without knocking, because I never liked the formality of announcement. He had only a second to process that the person he'd been told had died 8 months ago was standing before him, leaning on nothing, wearing scrubs, with a patch of Connaught scars that did not need explanation. He blinked. First one blink, then another. Then his face fell the way a curtain might when a stage trick goes wrong. For a moment he didn't speak. The office, which had previously been the domain of procedure, filled with a public silence that felt like live wire. "Vance," he said at last, and it sounded like both a question and a benediction. I sat. I did not make a show of the moment. I did not stand and take a bow. There are stories where the underdog storms the palace. Mine is quieter. "Captain," I said. "Morning." It was he who looked stunned. He rubbed the bridge of his nose as if to confirm the sight was not a projection. His first words were not dramatic. He reached for a binder instead. We had the record," he began, his voice thin and practiced. His mouth made the shape of apology even before the words arrived. "There was a body. The identification—" "You did what you had to do," I interrupted. I didn't need the routine of a defensive apology. I knew he had done what seemed necessary in a moment of chaos. I also wanted to watch him reckon with how tidy stories can be and how much chaos they hide. He swallowed and sat back, the corners of his eyes wet. "You walked back into my office," he said finally. I thought. He didn't finish. What he thought was not a thing he could bear to say. "You thought I was dead," I offered, "and then you stopped thinking those other things." The sentence was not accusatory as much as it was observational. He had been given a version of me that permitted him to be certain about the world. Certainty is a different kind of comfort. He stood up abruptly, and then stopped. His hands were knotted in an old soldier's motion, a habit from a life of holding bad outcomes in a framework of procedure. He let the word hang like a small, insufficient rope. "Are you angry?" I asked. It was a cruel question in a soft voice. It was also a ridiculous one. Anger is too simple for the tangle between us. He looked down at his hands. "Yes," he admitted, "and ashamed and relieved it's a mess." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh, and maybe it was. "I went home that night thinking we had done everything right. I believed the reports. We all did. To find you here," he gestured helplessly, "I don't even know how to put it. It undermines every neat line on my report." I watched him find the texture of words he needed. We had a body that fit the description, and there were constraints. I can't excuse it. We all made calls, bad calls. The hospital was a war zone. I will own that. I will fix the things in the after-action. I will... He searched my face, looking for permission to install his own penance in the form of policy. "I will make it right publicly." "Make what right?" I asked. "Compensate for their need for tidy grief. Fix a plaque." There was no sarcasm in the question, only a patient dissection. He flinched and then spoke like a man trying to breathe into remorse. "I'll tell the press. I'll make statements. I'll ask for a full review. You can do all of that," I said. "Or you can do something slower and harder. You can change how you count people when the world shakes. You can change the assumptions. You can keep asking if the person on the slab is the one we think they are. You can teach people not to settle for comfort over truth." I was not trying to shame him. I was offering him the ledger for honest work. Public apologies are fine. Plaques are fine. But if the only thing we change is the wording on a plaque, nothing changes. He nodded slowly. "I hear you," he said. "And I'm sorry, very much." He was a man accustomed to managing operations. The difference between regret and system change is the difference between feeling bad and making the next night less perilous. We spoke for a long time after that, not in accusations but in inventory. He told me, in halting bursts, the chain of decisions that had led to the misidentification. He blamed the chaos of the scene, limited resources, and a rushed process. He was honest about the way people in charge sometimes prefer an answer to ambiguity. I told him about the months I had spent in other hospitals, about the tug of being declared dead in the public eye while undergoing painful reconstructive work. He listened, and in listening his face changed. There was relief in that reverence, relief that he had been given a second version of the world to attend to. I did not ask for an apology on camera. I wanted a private acknowledgement, a correction of the ledger. He wanted to make amends. The thing about making amends in these systems is that it must be visible to be meaningful. He would have to take the tough steps publicly. The public steps came slowly and awkwardly. He convened a press conference. He spoke with a voice that had been built-in training. He read from a statement that had been vetted and re-vetted. He said, "We made mistakes that night in identification and triage." The words landed like stones. Marcus stood behind him and nodded. Sarah stood with Marcus, smaller than the other two, but steadier in a way that surprised the press. I sat in the third row, my hands folded, my face not a mask, but a map. He apologized publicly. The cameras liked the shape of contrition. People called him brave for it. The public liked its own tidy arcs and used his admission as closure. But the real work was quieter. Captain Miller instituted new procedures for mass casualty identification and promised to invest in portable identification technology and better training. He walked the floors with me and with the trauma team, listening, asking questions, taking notes. He showed up at staff meetings without being asked, and that mattered more than any press conference. He did not make me a martyr at the center of his narrative. He put my experience in the middle of a practical agenda. For that, I was grateful. There is a dignity to public apology when it's followed by actions that are concrete and measured. The courtroom scenes were inevitable. The prosecution used the misidentification as part of a larger conversation about responsibility and the system's failures. Silas Thorne's defense argued madness and grievance, and the public intermediated emotion into legalese. I watched the trial in silence most of the time, sometimes flinching when a witness described my name being read aloud among the dead. In the gallery, I sat with Sarah and Marcus and a few colleagues who had been closest. Captain Miller came once or twice, sweating through suit sleeves, and he would sit far enough away to look like a civilian at a play. When the verdict came, people clapped. For a moment, it felt like applause was the last currency left to the public, one hand meeting another and pretending that the sound could rectify lives. The decision did not solve the administrative errors or make my recovery less expensive or less painful. It did not remove my nightmares. It only affirmed that someone had been held accountable for his violence. Eventually, the public attention waned. The plaques remained on fences and newscasters moved on because society funnels attention where it's most dramatic and then siphons it away toward the next outrage. I was left with the slow matter of living, which is not dramatic but is the only kind that matters. I returned to the hospital not as a symbol but as a person who wanted to work. People asked me in interviews that came later whether the experience changed me. It had, I said, because the things that matter change people. It made me less tolerant of institutions that prefer their narratives tidy. It made me more patient with the kind of small, daily courage that keeps a ward functioning at 3 a.m. I said I had no appetite for hero worship. I did not tell them that most days the work remained the same, people needing hands and presence. My formal return to the staff came without fanfare. They cleared a position for me as charge nurse on the night shift, not because anyone wanted me to be a public face, but because they needed someone who could do the unseen work. I took it. There was an odd contentment in returning to the things that first drew me to nursing, the feeling of being useful, of having a small ledger of human needs and meeting them. My military training, quietness under pressure, the ability to move in a room without drawing attention, fit the ward again. But I also carried the scars, literal and otherwise, as testimony. Patients would look at my face, and sometimes there would be a flicker in their eyes, recognition of the story they had seen on television or in a newspaper. Some thanked me, offering condolences as if for someone else. Some asked how I had the courage to come back. I would smile and say what was true. I did not feel particularly courageous. Courage was a messy, practical thing. Showing up when the lights were low, holding a patient's hand during a code, staying when it would be easier to leave. I had no interest in auditioning for public roles. I wanted to be in the room. There were nights when the past returned with the insistence of an uninvited guest. There were sounds, an echo of glass, the faint hiss of oxygen that would make me freeze. I would breathe through it, count out small boxes of the room and keep working. The nightmares thinned as months passed, not by magic, but because the therapy had taught me tools, grounding, breath, an acceptance that fear is a guest you can welcome without offering at the house. I had PTSD symptoms at times, triggers that could make me disassociate. I did not deny it. I worked with counselors. I learned to name my reaction. Naming gave it less power. The nature of leadership in the months that followed changed in ways that were not always obvious. Captain Miller and I found an awkward camaraderie. We were not friends in any sentimental sense. We had both been part of a sequence that had broken things and then tried to fix them. He would consult me about drills. I'd push back when his ideas felt more like theater than utility. Once, in a tense late-night meeting about resource allocation, I told him bluntly, "We need better training for the people who will be making those calls. We need redundancy in identification. And if you want to make it right, build the system so no one else is miscounted because we needed comfort." He listened and then made it happen. It was not a grand gesture. It was budgets and meetings and an insistence that practice match rhetoric. That's what reconciliation looks like in institutions. Not reconciliation as absolution, but reconciliation as applied pressure toward better systems. There were moments of tenderness that came from small sources. Leo, who had been the child in room 410, visited the ward once with his mother. He had outgrown the stuffed dinosaur, but he gave me a drawing that had "Thank you" in big, uneven letters. He asked for my autograph with the solemnity of a child at a memorial. I signed it awkwardly. My hand trembled only a little. That drawing lives on my refrigerator now. On the day I walked into Captain Miller's office, and he looked at me with that astonished, shame-tinged face, the media had not been present. When I finally walked back into public life, months later at a small community event where survivors and first responders gathered, we stood together and spoke about the messy truth of recovery. Marcus, who had carried his guilt like an invisible bruise, had started a program at the hospital for family support during critical events. He stood next to me at the podium and did not apologize anymore in fragments. He offered a full-bodied way of making restitution, time, presence, a commitment to training. As for Silas Thorne, he remained in custody. The court had given him years. The years will carry the weight of his choices. I felt no pleasure at his sentence. Punishment is not balm. It is, at best, a small measure of social order. My life did not become a biography of resilience with a predictable moral. Hard things happened still. There were days when my hands betrayed me and I could not hold a tray. There were nights when a memory of falling would make me cling to the bedrail. There were relationships that became complicated because people had to reconcile their grief with the fact that I was still alive and human. But there was also an emergent truth that I liked. The quiet competence I had acquired in uniform translated into a kind of leadership that didn't need applause. It showed up as the way people relied on me in the liveliest moments. The man who had once been my commanding officer in the Rangers, Lieutenant Colonel Andrews, came to visit once at Harborview, older and with a softer jaw than I'd remembered. He had been at the steps of St. Jude's for the ribbon ceremony months before, and had sent a terse letter that was both a compliment and a rebuke. "You did what you always do. Welcome back." He did not cry when he saw me. He shook my hand like a fellow soldier and said, "You're home, Vance." It was an odd thing. Home felt less like place and more like a permission. In the thick of recovery, I had to make choices. Do I use this as a platform to speak loudly, or do I use it as an opportunity to change small things where I could? I chose the latter. I started teaching drills for the night staff, not flashy, press-driven exercises, but the kind that mattered for movement in smoke and patient identification when the lights go out. I taught them to assume nothing and to check twice. I taught them to carry extra markers and to make redundant tags and to document in ways that machines could read even when chaos reigned. You do not have to be famous to make change. You have to be present. When people asked me why I came back, I told them the same thing in different ways. Sometimes I said it plainly, because someone has to do the unseen work. Sometimes I gave the more romantic answer, because I belong where the night is darkest. Both were true. The quiet hours are where the human ledger is balanced, someone counting pulses, someone holding a hand, someone keeping watch. On the anniversary of the blast, the hospital held a small ceremony. There were candles and a short speech, and then Captain Miller asked if I would say a few words. He did not ask for theatrics. He asked for truth. I thought about the tidy story the world had made for me, and how it had hurt the people who had been left behind by their own assumptions. I thought about the hands that had been steady when the world tilted, and the things we had to change to make sure less fear passes for knowledge. I stood in front of a small group of people, colleagues, survivors, administrators, patients, reporters who still sniffed at a good headline. I did not make a speech so much as a little accounting. "I was left for dead in the blast," I said, and the line landed differently now than it had that first night. Then I said, "They left a story in my place. We have a choice, to keep telling tidy stories or to admit the mess and do the work. I'm tired of tidy." There was a low, almost inaudible laugh that moved through the crowd. It wasn't humor so much as relief that someone was finally willing to call the narrative by its proper name. A young nurse came up to me afterwards and told me, in a voice thick with tears, that she'd been thinking of leaving the job, that the night shift had seemed too dangerous now. I told her the truth. It's dangerous. So are other things. If you stay, you'll make it safer. She nodded as if I'd handed her a map. I think maps are underrated as a form of charity. The final arc of this story is not a tidy, triumphant banner. There is no miraculous erasure of scars, no pretense that cost is gone. Instead, there is a different kind of victory, recognition, carried not as applause, but as responsibility. Captain Miller learned that public apologies must be matched with procedural change. Marcus learned how to carry guilt outward into action that helped others. Sarah learned that grief could be a kind of stubborn fuel, not only a wound. I learned that being visible and alive does not make you a trophy to be polished by others' remorse. It makes you a person to be engaged with when the lights go down. The scars remain. The nightmares come sometimes. I do not pretend otherwise, but the public story about me is no longer only a neat memorial on a fence. It is a complicated history that includes failure, grief, accountability, and slow repair. 8 months after they wrote me off, I walked back into an office and looked a man who had been in charge in the eye. He recoiled at first, because the world had told him a comforting lie. Confronted with the ramshackle reality, he did the harder thing. He acted. That is what it means, in my view, to be redeemed, not to be absolved, but to be made to reckon and then to build better. If there is any lesson I would pass on, it is this. Don't let tidy stories take the place of truth. Respect the slow work of getting back. Honor the people who keep vigil in the quiet hours, and when institutions fail, hold them to the tedious, necessary labor of repair. If this story has moved you, and you believe quiet people deserve a loud listener, like and share it. Those are small things, but they help the right stories find ears. For my part, I went back to the ward and sat in a room with fluorescent lights and soft beeps and the smell of lemon cleaner. I put my name badge back on. It was scarred but legible. I tucked my hair back with the same frayed elastic I had used as a nurse and a soldier. When the lights went down that night, I checked on Mrs. Gable and Leo, and then I stood at the window and watched the city breathe. They had left me for dead in the blast. 8 months later, I walked back into his office, and my commander could not believe his eyes. He also could not unmake what had been done. He could, however, help make sure the next counting was fairer. That, in the end, felt like the most complete kind of return.